Hey everyone, and welcome back to Storytime with Sarah. We are still making our way through Sideways Stories from Wayside School, our first chapter book on the channel. If you haven't seen the last few videos, you definitely need to go back and watch them before you see this one so that you're caught up on who our characters are. And if you're ready to go ahead and come cuddle up because it's Storytime with Sarah, and today we're doing chapter 7 and 8. Chapter 7, Calvin. Calvin had a big round face. "Calvin," said Mrs. Jules, "I want you to take this note to Mrs. Zarbs for me." "Miss Zarbs?" asked Calvin. "Yes, Miss Zarbs," said Mrs. Jules. "You know where she is, don't you?" "Yes," said Calvin. "She's on the 19th story." "That's right, Calvin," said Mrs. Jules. "Take it to her." Calvin didn't move. "Well, what are you waiting for?" asked Mrs. Jules. "She's on the 19th story," said Calvin. "Yes, we've already established that fact," said Mrs. Jules. "The 19th story," Calvin repeated. "Yes, Calvin, the 19th story," said Mrs. Jules. "Now take it to her before I lose my patience." "But Mrs. Jules," said Calvin. "Now, Calvin," said Mrs. Jules, "unless you'd rather go home on the kindergarten bus." "Yes, ma'am," said Calvin. Slowly he walked out the door. Laughed Terence. "Take it to the 19th story." "Give it to Mrs. Zarbs," hooted Myron. "Have fun on the 19th story," called Jason. Calvin stood outside the door to the classroom. He didn't know where to go. As you know, when the builder built Wayside School, he accidentally built it sideways. But he also forgot to build the 19th story. He built the 18th and the 20th, but no 19th. He said he was very sorry. There was also no Miss Zarbs. Miss Zarbs taught the class on the 19th story. Since there was no 19th story, there was no Miss Zarbs. And besides that, as if Calvin didn't have enough problems, there was no note. Mrs. Jules had never given Calvin the note. "Boy, this is just great," thought Calvin. "Just great. I am supposed to take a note that I don't have to a teacher who doesn't exist and who teaches on a story that was never built." He didn't know what to do. He walked down to the 18th story, then back up to the 20th, then back down to the 18th, and back up again to the 20th. There was no 19th story. There was never a 19th story, and there never will be a 19th story. Calvin walked down to the administration office. He decided to put the note in Miss Zarb's mailbox, but there wasn't one of those either. That didn't bother Calvin too much, however, since he didn't have a note. He looked out the window and saw Lewis, the yard teacher, shooting baskets. "Lewis will know what to do," he thought. Calvin went outside. "Hey, Lewis," Calvin called. "Well, hi, Calvin," said Lewis. He tossed him the basketball. Calvin dribbled up and took a shot. He missed. Lewis tipped it in. "Do you want to play a game?" Lewis asked. "I don't have time," said Calvin. "I have to deliver a note to Miss Zarbs up on the 19th story." "Then what are you doing all the way down here?" Lewis asked. "There is no 19th story," said Calvin. "Then where is Miss Zarbs?" asked Lewis. "There is no Miss Zarbs." "What are you going to do with the note?" asked Lewis. "There is no note," said Calvin. "I understand," said Lewis. "Well, that's good," said Calvin, "because I sure don't." "It's very simple," said Lewis. You are not supposed to take no notes to no teachers. You already haven't done it." Calvin still didn't understand. "I'll just have to tell Mrs. Jules that I couldn't deliver the note," he said. "That's good," said Lewis. "The truth is always best. Besides, I don't think I understand what I said either." Calvin walked back up the 30 flights of stairs to Mrs. Jules' class. "Thank you very much, Calvin," said Mrs. Jules. Calvin said, "But I—" Mrs. Jules interrupted him. "That was a very important note, and I'm glad I was able to count on you." "Yes, but you see," said Calvin, "you delivered the note to Miss Zarbs on the 19th story? How did you do it?" asked Jason. "What do you mean, how did he do it?" asked Mrs. Jules. "He gave Miss Zarbs the note. Some people, Jason, are responsible." "But you see, Mrs. Jules," said Calvin, The note was very important, said Mrs. Jules. I told Miss Zarves not to meet me for lunch. Don't worry, said Calvin. She won't. Good, said Mrs. Jules. I have a coffee can full of Tootsie Roll Pops on my desk. You may help yourself to one for being such a good messenger. Thanks, said Calvin, but really, it was nothing. Chapter 8, Myron. Myron had big ears. He was elected class president. The children in Mrs. Jules' class expected him to be a good president. Other presidents were good speakers. Myron was even better. He was a good listener. But he had a problem. He didn't know what a class president was supposed to do. So he asked, "What am I supposed to do?" "It's a difficult job," said Mrs. Jules, "but you can do it. You must turn the lights on every morning and turn them off at the end of the day." "What?" asked Myron. "As a class president, you must learn to listen," said Mrs. Jules. "I'll repeat myself only one more time. You must turn the lights on every morning." "I heard you the first time," said Myron. "It just doesn't sound like much of a job." "It certainly is," said Mrs. Jules. "Without light, I can't teach, and the children cannot learn. Only you can give us that light. I think it's a very important job." "I guess so," said Myron. He wasn't convinced. "Here, let me show you how to work a light switch," said Mrs. Jules. "I already know how," said Myron. "I've been turning lights on and off all my life." "Oh, very good," said Mrs. Jules. "You'll make a fine president." Myron wanted to be the best president ever, but it was such an easy job, he thought, that anybody could do it. When school let out that day, Myron stayed behind. He turned out the lights by flicking the switch down. "Excellent," said Mrs. Jules. On his way home, Myron heard a horrible noise. First, there was a loud screeching, then a sharp squeal, a roaring engine, and then the very faint sound of a girl crying. Myron ran to see what had happened. Dana was bent over in the middle of the road. "What's the matter?" asked Myron. "My dog, Pugsy, was hit by a car," Dana cried. "Who did it?" asked Myron. "I don't know. They sped away," Dana sobbed. "Well, that's not important. We've got to try to save Pugsy," said Myron. Pugsy lay unconscious in the street. Myron carefully picked her up. He carried her 2 miles to the vet. Dana cried at his side. "Don't worry, Dana," said Myron. "She'll be all right." But he really wasn't so sure. He gave Pugsy to the vet, walked Dana home, and then walked home himself. Dana was so upset that she forgot to thank him. Myron didn't mind. He thought that was what being class president was all about. The next morning, before he went to school, Myron went to Dana's house. Pugsy was there. She seemed all right. Dana petted her, and Pugsy licked her face. "See, Myron, she's all right," said Dana. "The vet said that you brought her in just in time." "Hi, Pugsy," said Myron, and he petted her. Pugsy bit his hand. "I guess she doesn't know you," said Dana. "She was unconscious yesterday when you saved her life." Dana's mother put some medicine and a Band-Aid on Myron's hand. Then she drove the children to school. They were late. They ran up the stairs to Mrs. Jules' class. The room was completely dark. "It's about time you got here, Myron," said Mrs. Jules. "We have no lights." "Why didn't somebody else just turn them on?" asked Myron. "Because you're our class president," said Mrs. Jules. "Show Stephen how to work the lights. From now on, he will be class president." Myron showed Stephen how to turn on the lights. He flicked the switch up. At the end of the day, Myron showed Stephen how to turn the lights off. He flicked the switch down. After a week, Stephen finally caught on. He made a good president. The lights were on every morning. Myron, who was only president for a day, was the best president in the history of Wayside School. It was just that nobody knew it. That's all for today. Tune in next time for our next couple of chapters. They're real treats and you won't want to miss them. Like or subscribe to the channel so that you get notified when the next video releases. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.